Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the API Hangout. This is episode number 49. Over the course of the last, 48 episodes, we have covered a whole range of topics all about APIs, and we have discussed things which are specific to the verticals, things which are really available for the beginners who are getting started in their API journey, to the folks who are a little bit more of a veteran in this space of APIs, whether you're talking about security, whether you're talking about design, or you're talking about security, governance, any of those areas. If you're looking at financial services, if you're looking at open standards, we've had discussions about all of those things. So today, we're going to be exploring yet another exciting area of APIs, and that is going to be about design-driven API management using Open API Specification. Before we proceed, perhaps, I think we'll do a quick round of introductions between myself and the amazing panel that we have today. So I am Buddha, product evangelist at Tyke, and I'm going to be hosting these API Hangouts. If you have not been to one, then hello and welcome. And if you have and you are returning back, then welcome back to the API Hangout. With me today is John. So hello, maybe a quick round of introduction. John, Laurencio, Furkan, and Jeffy. Hello and welcome to the API Hangout.
Thank you. So I'll start. I'm John Clifton. I'm the product manager for the core APIM space here at Tyke. So I'm responsible for the product side for everything to do with your day-to-day API management. So the Open API spec, for instance, is part of my little area. And I'll pass to Laurencio.
Hello, everyone. I'm a developer. One of the main things we're doing, it's also related to OAS big time. So that's why we're here.
Wonderful. Furkan, maybe?
I'm Furkan. So I'm a senior software engineer in the core API management team. So, open source gateway in GitHub, I'm one of the main contributors of it.
Great to have you. All right. Last but not least, Jeffy.
Hello, I'm Jeffy. I'm a software engineer here at Tyke. I work with this amazing colleagues here. Yep, looking forward to a great discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being part of it. And we really thought that I think we'll have a nice little panel of folks who have been working in the space of Open API Specification as well as API management, and get the perspective of not just developers, but also, senior product managers, and look at the different aspects of design-driven API management, different aspects of Open API Specification itself, some of the pros, some of the cons. We'll be tackling some of these things. But what I will do is, over the next few minutes, I'm going to just set the scene a little bit so that everyone is pretty much on the same page, hopefully, just to give a basic understanding of what we are really going to be talking about today. At any point, if you do have a question, or if you want to dive in or jump into the discussion, then use the raise hand function if you want, or hit me with a Q&A or a chat or a comment, or just unmute yourself. That is also perfectly fine. With that, let's dive really quickly into today's topic. As I said, we're going to be discussing design-driven API management with OAS. And I think by now it's pretty obvious that APIs have become ubiquitous with product development. Any product that is out there, a digital product that you touch, is most likely using APIs in some way or the other. So the ubiquity of APIs is no longer in question, but it's really, the conversation has shifted to how do we do things better? And I think as a big part of that has been the discussions around open standards, open specifications, and the way you actually design and develop software. Taking the step further, we are going to be looking at two potential paradigms that have come up in this space, and that is design first versus code first. So let's look at a little bit of how the software development lifecycle works at this point of time. So if you really think about that, the way it works is you've got a bunch of people who would ideally have identified an opportunity. They've got a need that they have identified, and they have written down a specification, a list of business requirements that is essentially going to be addressed by building a product or a software in this case. So that is typically your step one. And then step two after that is where we have this sort of paradigm where you've got design first or a code first approach, which is where you start building or actually go into the development of the product. So what is the difference then? So if you think about code first is essentially taking that specification and you go ahead and start building your API straight away. You are coding, you're writing code, and then once you're while you're doing that, or maybe once you're done with it, you start thinking about documentation, then you're testing and then iterating, and then you are publishing your application and so on and so forth. The other side of it, the other way of doing it, which is the design first approach, also known as the API first approach, by the way, is where you are essentially taking those business requirements and you are translating that into what essentially are API contracts. It's essentially the blueprint for how you're going to be building out your different APIs. And I think that becomes very, very important. That's where you're not really starting off with writing code, but you're essentially writing almost like a manual, a guide to putting things together, the building blocks of your application or your APIs in this case. So once you've got that manifest, so to speak, your blueprint ready, which is in this case, something like your Open API specification, you would then take that and start coding out your application. There are pros and cons to each one of them. If you think about design first, I think it really emphasizes the reusability, the extendability, potentially the integration elements of your APIs a lot more. Therefore, it essentially makes sure that you're spending a little bit more time planning upfront as opposed to trying to do things on the fly a little bit more. So that's kind of a little bit more investment upfront to get the gains a little bit later. Code first goes into, okay, my ultimate objective is to go to market in the shortest period of time, and I want to get the product out there as quickly as possible. And that's where you go with code first. So really, depending on your use case, depending on your need, you might choose one or the other. The more I think the world at this point of time seems to be shifting towards a design first approach, because you most likely, when you're developing code today or building software, it's not really a short-term goal. In most cases, you're trying to build something that's probably going to be lasting. There's going to be iterations on top of it. There's going to be multiple teams potentially working on it, and you're going to be, hopefully serving a whole bunch of clients as you go along. So that's kind of the world that we're living in. So that's kind of the first part of today's topic. I think we'll move on to the second bit, or maybe the last bit, which is the Open API specification, to give you a quick rundown of that. So the Open API specification, if you just look at definitions, it defines how we describe the interface of a RESTful API, regardless of the language in which it's built. So in the simplest form, I think in a nutshell, this is what Open API specification tries to accomplish with what it has. And just to give you a sense of the history of Open API specification, it started off actually as Swagger. It was called Swagger specification. I think it's also known as OAS 2.0, if I'm not wrong, but Swagger specification is what it started off as back in 2010 by a guy called Tony Tam. He was trying to create his own project, which was WordNik. I think it was like sort of a dictionary, word dictionary that he was trying to build out. And he thought that making something like this with a bunch of tool sets would be quite beneficial and will help him long term. So cut to 5 years down the line, and it suddenly became really, really popular in a world where there were a lot of disconnect between the different specifications that were out there, different ways in which people were building their software. And that's what led to its acquisition by SmartBear in 2015. So this was an important element, because once that acquisition happened, what SmartBear recognized was the importance of an open specification, and they started the Open API initiative together with a whole bunch of other industry experts and industry leaders, and donated what at that point of time was the Swagger specification to the Open API initiatives to keep things open and available to everyone, renamed it to the Open API specification, and that's how we get to where we are today. So that's the little brief history of OAS, just to give you a sense of how we have gotten here. Beyond this, I wanted to give you a quick idea of what resources are available. So if you go to the Swagger website, which is swagger.io, they really clearly define what Open API is all about. And I think we've gone into the definition already. Open API specification is an API description format for REST APIs. They do specifically call out REST APIs, which is very interesting. Maybe something for a discussion later on. But it's very interesting that they've specifically, this was built for REST APIs, which is why that's what we're talking about here. Now, an interesting thing that again gets a little tricky for people to understand sometimes is the distinction between what Swagger is versus what OAS is. So OAS is the description, the API description, the format itself. Swagger is actually a set of open source tools. Actually, it's probably a combination of open source tools as well as some proprietary tools built on top of it. And that's essentially, it's a tooling ecosystem that enables you to design, build, document, and consume REST APIs better. There are a few different components to this. You've got the Swagger editor, the UI, CodeGen, so all of these different things are available. And what they really try to do is, again, help you take that API design first approach to product development, but equally make it easy for you to generate your code. So it's not just about designing that manifest or blueprint. You still have to build out the logic and make it available for consumption. So there's a whole range of other things. So Swagger with its toolkit kind of makes some of those things really, really easy for you to do, specifically around documentation, which is what I think they have defined here a little bit more. And I'm sure you would have used some of this already, where you've got Swagger UI and you've got interactive API documentation, which is automatically created if you're following the specification in a really, really simplified manner. The other thing to just note, just to give you a sense of what an Open API specification doc really looks like, the basic structure of the documentation. So the definitions can be written in either YAML or JSON. So there are two ways. YAML seems to be the preferred way. I think that's what we've been using. It seems to be a little bit cleaner, but again, it's your preference. Both of those options are available to you. And if I just zoom in a little bit, this is a typical structure. This is not a complete structure, but it just gives you a sense of how it looks like. And if you drill down into the components of this, you would see that there you start off with Open API, specifying the version that you're going to be using, then some info, which is essentially metadata, information about the servers that you're going to be using, essentially for your different environments that you might be tagging to, and then the parts of your API, basically what your end users or clients are going to be using to call your APIs eventually. But this by no means is exhaustive in nature. There are multiple different components that makes up an Open API document. And if you dive a little bit deeper, I think this gives you a full set of those. You start off with an Open API object, then you've got your info, which is your metadata about APIs, your servers, your paths. Components are really, really powerful. Actually, this is essentially what enables reusability of specific segments within your schema, which is really, really powerful if you're building, APIs with a whole range of different endpoints and, different things. So components are really, really powerful components of your Open API specification. Then you can declare your security protocols, what you're going to be using, how you're going to be using that, not really the implementation, but what exactly that is going to look like, tags, and then you've got external documentations to go with it. So by all means, I'll share all of these links with you so that you can deep dive a little bit further into this. But I thought I'll give you a bit of a sense of, if you came across an Open API specification, a document like, say, this, which is a very popular example of Open API specification. This is the Swagger pet store example that is readily available. You can interact with it. You can play with, let me see if I can get the Swagger
editor.
There you go. I think if I open this up, so it'll give you, so this is kind of what it looks like when you're talking about interactive documentation. So all of the different endpoints, the different parts have been described in an Open API spec document. And this is how it looks like when it's being documented. And you can interact with this. If you were to, say, do a GET request, you can very easily interact with it and you'll get responses straight away. So that's your basic structure. Sorry,
but I put in the chat a link to also that had a side-by-side display of the Open API and UI. So you can open that one and you can play with the code, and in real time you get changes on your UI.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Okay. All right. So really, I think when you look at a document like this, I think the first time I looked at a document like this, which is the pet store in itself, it can feel a little bit overwhelming because it keeps going on and on and on. But if you are aware of the different components that makes up this document, what you will realize is you don't have to list every one of those things right up front. The critical elements within this basic structure, as it specifies here, is really defining that open API, which version that you're going to be using, the info, the metadata that goes into your API, the metadata about your API, and the paths that the URLs that are going to be called. So as a minimum viable product, that's where you get started. And then you can start building on top of it. As you might be adding on different parts to it. You might be adding, if you figure out that there are reusable components out there, then you can start going about creating those. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea about what design-driven approach to API management with OAS might look like. The thing that we haven't touched about is API management. And I think we'll have plenty of time to discuss that as well. But really, if you think about ultimately what we want to do with APIs is to make them production ready. We want to make sure that our APIs are not just developed or built, but they are equally ready for consumption by external or internal users, which means that you want to make sure that your APIs are well tested, they are secure, they have the right versioning possibilities in there. If they need to be extended, they are done properly. If they have to be cataloged properly, they are done. So all of those different elements that essentially is about management of your APIs, making sure that it is production ready beyond just the basics of development and design of your APIs is what API management is all about. And that's what we do at Tyke, but we don't necessarily need to go into that at this point. But so I want to start opening up this discussion with our current panelists. And of course, at any point of time, if you in the audience, which is a really nice and healthy audience that we seem to have today, which is fantastic. If you have questions, just feel free to either jump in. Everyone will have an opportunity to speak because I am gracing you with that power now. So you all have an opportunity to unmute yourself if you do have questions, or raise your hand, or put in your questions here in your Q&A. So I think Nagesh, you asked whether you could share the Swagger link. I believe Laurentiu has done that, but I think you've only done that for the host and panelists, so no worries. Let me just put it to everyone. There you go. I think that should help you out. All right, so folks, what do you think? How do you feel about Open API specifications, design-driven approach? John, maybe we'll start off with you. Initial thoughts on OAS. I know we've deliberately not spoken about the pros and cons yet, because I'm hoping that's going to be part of our discussion. But really, going to start off with our initial conversation, initial thoughts on OAS.
I mean, for me, I think you hit on it really nicely when you were talking about sort of starting small and building out. I think you've got several different ways of approaching the whole thing. In theory, you've got a linear call coming from a client through your gateway to your server, and the work's done in that path. But when it comes to development, you could start kind of anywhere. You could define your API, how things are going to talk to each other. You could write your server and then build the API off that, like you said. And I think really the key thing that we've seen as we've been going through this, it's about just taking small bites. Understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and don't try and go for the whole spec in one big go, because like you said, it's a very flexible, very powerful specification, and exactly because of that, it can be quite monstrous to try and get to grips with. So coming into it, certainly when I've been sort of looking at it from my point of view and with the team helping, it's very much about, well, what are the things you must have? Great. Now let's start messing about in the Swagger editor, and you can see how in fact, let me just show you the link that we just shared around. You can very easily see. So this is exactly the thing you just showed, but at the great big pet store definition. But you can see that the editor will really nicely generate things for you. So this documentation is generated directly from here. So you can muck about with it, and it'll automatically get reflected in here. We do something quite similar within our gateway as well. So when you come to that point, you can import it in. In fact, I think I have one. Give me 1 second, and I will have one live. There we go. That should get us a. There we go. So you can see similarly from our. This isn't meant to be a plug for Tyke. It's a nice, easy thing to think about. You can, once you understand the shape of what you're trying to do, you can very quickly. So you can see that was a one-click thing. You can import these great big specifications in, and you can see what does that really mean in terms of how my gateway is going to work. So all I'm really saying is you can do it in a variety of different ways. It's a big, complicated thing, but from my experience, start small, build out, and really start to grab the new features as you find you need them, rather than trying to go for the whole thing in one great big go. I think that's, I mean, guys, what do you think? What does anyone disagree?
I like to get more real, and as a developer, I don't like to write documentation, right? So most probably I'm gonna start writing code, and then I'm gonna write some documentation for it. But I'm 99% sure that every developer does this at first. So, and I can do a little bit of parallel discussion comparison with test-driven development. So it's more like that. As you age and you get more experience, you realize the benefits of test-driven development, writing your test cases, be covered with that, and then write your code. So for me, designing your API first, it's like that. It makes you think about it, go through the whole process of how this will work, who will work with it, how people will integrate, and you'll start to design it first. The good thing is that you can collaborate with others into defining all the technicalities, because so the good thing about Open API, it's that it's a standard that everyone can understand regardless of their job. So it's not just developers, it's product managers, designers, front-end developers, whatever. So they can all contribute to this. So this is a very big advantage. And then you can start writing code. On the other side, it also depends on the type of the project you run, right? So if you're if your APIs are not widely exposed to the outside world, it's just something internal, and you want to rush into go to market very fast. So you might find this in almost all the startups at the beginning. You might do the code first approach. But if your APIs are very important for a business in terms of you're monetizing them, or maybe you're exposing to developers outside your company, designing first, it's, I think, to me, mandatory, as you need to set the standards properly from the beginning. Yeah,
it's a very, very interesting one, right? Because I think there's always this sort of fight between, you want to have standardization because, it's what it creates the foundation for innovation eventually, but it also in a lot of minds comes across as inhibition, because you're being asked to do things in a particular way, and you're kind of being restricting my freedom to code in the way that I want to. So thoughts on that? Maybe Jeffy, if you might want to jump in, Jeffy and Furkan, in terms of the code first versus the design first approach that we spoke about. How have you sort of approached that so far when you've been building out products, or in your day-to-day life? What does that actually look like when you are actually implementing this?
Yeah, when we started, I've been there. I've been doing the code first approach initially. There was a scenario when our product wanted to go like right away to the market, and we were doing code first, and it went well for some time. But after some time, the team grew, the number of people grew, and everybody had different type of opinions. Everything was opinionated, and the collaboration was a thing which we missed, because we right away go and code. That was just with the backend, right? I mean, not even let alone the product and front end people. It's just with the backend, and we write APIs, we push APIs, and we make it live. But nobody gets a chance to discuss their opinions and other things. And then we had an opportunity to monetize our APIs, and we had to sell our APIs. Then there comes all complexities of what happens when we change this contract and all of that stuff, and that was very difficult. And then at a later point, we thought if we had an opportunity to make a collab with the whole team, the white team, some pitfalls could have been avoided. And I think that's the most important part of going design first, where you design something, then put it up for review, and ask comments from others, and then improve things if needed. Or else, once it is logged, we go with the log version. That seems good in a long term. But for the short term, if you don't know what you're trying, or if you don't know what the market needs, I think code first still works for some time. But if you are lucky enough to get the right market fit, then you'll find the need of going design first rather than going code first.
That's great. I think you've touched upon one pro that I think we were trying to uncover, which is collaboration. I think it's standardization in a big way enables collaboration, or at least encourages collaboration, because ultimately you want to be able to speak the same language that is understandable across an organization. You don't want different teams to be working on different things, and that then needs to be integrated somehow. And that's creating a whole lot of mess, especially teams that are growing across, different boundaries, different languages. A team even like us, for instance, that's got across so many different countries at this point of time, things may potentially mean different things in simple languages. So standardization there just makes sure that there is one single source of truth, and B, that you're essentially all on the same page and working towards that same goal. So I think collaboration you've hit upon really, really important. The other thing that comes, sorry, yeah, Laurencio, you had something?
Just wanted to say that for developers in this chat, when you hear integration between backend and frontend, it's a help. If you have proper documentation, like written down, then you know what to expect, and integration is much easier to do.
You are absolutely right there. So, which takes me to, I think, the next step there, where it's also in a big way enabling developer efficiency, productivity of developers, and making sure that once you've got that design there, you're kind of all working towards that same goal, and ideally working with tools that also adhere to the same standard, which means that you don't have to relearn things or learn new things to be able to interact with systems. So curious there, Furkan, in terms of, again, your experience with working with OAS so far, and Taik, I think, any thoughts on potential helpfulness of OAS or open standards towards collaboration or towards developer productivity specifically?
So, Laurent, you talked about the front-end and back-end integration. For that, I want to give an example. So, think that two developer front-end and back-end, they are developing same feature, but let's say that back-end guy is not ready. So, back-end side of the work is complex and front-end one is easier. So in that case, how are you gonna go with that? So the front-end guy needs a server that returns an answer to you when the front-end makes a request. It should get a response. So in that situation, with Tyke, for example, there is a mock response feature of mock response in OAS. So when you enable that feature with Tyke, so from the OAS documentation, it understands example possible responses and returns you. So the front-end guy doesn't have to wait for backend. So just enable the mock response temporarily, and then implement the front-end according to the example responses by using the powerful feature. And then when the backend is ready, so the mock response can be disabled and the integration can continue to work. So that's one cool example that I can show with Tyke and OAS.
Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. There are a couple of questions coming in. Thank you so much for that, Furkan. There are a couple of questions coming in. I wonder, Ed, you've asked a very pertinent question here, and I think that might be in the wheelhouse of John. But Ed, if you are comfortable, would you like to maybe unmute yourself and just ask the question live? Otherwise, I'm happy to ask it on your behalf. Ed, if you're with us.
Yeah, apologies. I'm in a departure lounge, so I've got some background noise. But yeah, I work in automation for Cisco, and we basically have lots of customers that are wanting to try to integrate with lots of different platforms. And the biggest problem we have is that you can have like a specification like this, but how do you enforce standardization of your interfaces across multiple products and multiple teams? Because end customers for us are people that want to just consume your APIs. They don't want to have to work out whether there's an issue with formats or anything like that. So it's more about, as an organization, how do you kind of make sure that your specifications are aligned?
Thank you so much for the question. John, maybe you're in a good position to maybe respond to that initially.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think one of the things, it is one of the things we're looking at trying to help automate within the Type product family. I think to some extent it's got to be unfortunately, process and approvals in the first instance to ensure that people are following a template that you like the look of. One of the things that we've been looking at is how we can help sort of surface that sort of template concept within your API management software, for instance, to help enforce or encourage people to make good decisions. It's a difficult question though, and I think it's one that I would solve at the organizational level first, and then I'd look to bring the tooling in to help enforce and simplify.
And I think we've sort of had a discussion about this previously as well. And I think it's a similar thing. It's when it comes to standardization, I think we've had a similar discussion when it comes to API governance as well. I think within organization, whenever there is that need for, something that everyone needs to come together, there is always going to be a bit of sometimes friction, but ultimately what you do need is that buy-in, and that getting that buy-in can sometimes be really, really challenging. And the buy-in is obviously not at just one level. It has to be ideally at all different levels, because unless you're all on the same page, it's going to fall apart, because that's ultimately the idea. So in some cases, we have seen a centralized approach to this having worked, where you've almost got like a centralized committee, which is your governance committee or your specification standardization committee, that essentially works with different parts of your product, different parts of your business, to make sure that you're following or adhering to certain standards. There is obviously usually a document or a manifesto essentially that goes with it, and you make sure that that is being followed. It's funneled through that one team, some cases. And I think for smaller organizations that might potentially work. A lot of the other side of this is the federated approach to this, where you're kind of making teams responsible for adhering to that particular manifesto on their own end. Now, not everything is going to be applicable to that team, but they need to understand how what they are working on a day-to-day basis is going to be collaborating or contributing towards that specific goal. So there's a lot of that buy-in thing. There are multiple ways of doing that. I don't think there's a perfect way yet. I think organizations have taken different approaches to this, but I think the first thing is for people to understand the benefit or the value of doing this. If people are not convinced on the value of standardization within an organization, it's not going to work out, because then you'll always have questions, you'll always have friction. So I think having a very clear reason as to why you want standardization, and again, standardization doesn't have to be across every single thing. It might start off with something small, maybe within your product, where you just want to talk about maybe API definitions and how do we standardize that. And I think then take things forward and see how that works. So probably small steps to start off with, and get the buy-in with those baby steps, and then perhaps build on top of it. Once people start seeing the value, I think it's a lot easier to convince people on that. And I think that's something that we have seen on our end as well, where I think initially we also had, our API definition had a lot of different components, a lot of different things, and we ourselves felt the pain of that when we were thinking about integrating with external tools, or people trying to import things into our tool or exporting it out of it. People had challenges, and we had challenges trying to keep up with those requirements. So we saw the value of using the Open API specification, which is that, it's going to make our lives easier, because now it's an open standard. We are not reinventing the wheel. We are going to be adding on to that. But at the same time, for the end users, they are also familiar with the standard that we are going to be working with. So they are not having to learn something and therefore creating a barrier to entry for our own product, which why would we want to do that? So that was kind of the thing that got us at least bought in. I would imagine hopefully Laurencio and the others agree with that thought process.
I did have one other thing to add, actually, Buddha, that occurred to me while you were talking. There is a good point where technology can make your life worse. And I think that one of the things that can be quite painful is if you have a single source of truth, if your OAS definition is your single source of truth, and there's no additional steps that someone needs to take to deploy it into your gateway or into your client or wherever, I think you're in a much better position than if you're perhaps, one of the things that we've seen in the past is you'd take an OAS spec and you'd import it into a gateway, for instance, but then there are a number of additional steps to take after you've done that import to make it actually go live, because perhaps the security isn't set up automatically. So one of the design points we have is, and Furkan alluded to this, anywhere where the OAS spec gives us information we could use. So you've got an example, as part of writing a well-defined spec, you've put an example in on how it might be used and the sort of response you might get. That's fantastic for us because that's effectively mocking middleware. So we can go and generate mock middleware on the gateway as part of our import. So it's one less thing someone needs to do manually. So it's one less chance for someone to make a mistake or to diverge from best practices. So I think OAS is really helpful because it lets you have that single well-defined thing that you're probably keeping in Git. You can have Git actions that are validating to make sure that your spec is well formed. And because you don't have these additional manual steps or ability to diverge from best practices, it lends itself to good standardization. But like you said, there's work to do to get that in place. So it's not a tick done yet, but there's soon. But that's certainly something that helps everyone make good choices.
Absolutely. And I think we should not, obviously, whenever we talk about technology, it's obviously we want to talk about the pros of it, but there are always going to be cons of it as well. And I think similarly with OAS, sometimes it can be overwhelming when you're first getting started with it. There is a bit of a learning curve. I wouldn't say that, you can get started up and running just by reading the document straight off. I think you need to familiarize yourself with exactly how that process works. If you've been working code first or in different paradigms before, I think it will be something new, and it will be something that you have to understand a little bit, probably spend a little bit of time building and working with before you can get comfortable and say, okay, now I can start really doing this on a regular basis. Because sometimes there is that hesitation as well, right? When you're learning a new technology, like, okay, I'm spending a lot of time. Is it really going to be worth it? Can I just go back and keep doing the things that I've been doing because it's been working? So, there is always that little thing. So there is going to be a learning curve with anything new that you learn. But ultimately, once again, if you've got that buy-in for that long-term value and benefit of what it's going to be bringing in, then it's what's going to help you really in the long run. A question again coming in. We're getting some really nice questions coming in. Nagesha, I think I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If you're with us, if you would like to, you've asked a really interesting question. If you would like to unmute yourself and probably ask the question live, by all means, go ahead. Nagesha, if you're with us. Okay, if not, that's fine. I'm happy to ask on your behalf. This one probably for our developer friends here. So Nagesha asks, what is the difference between HTTP API, WebSocket API, and REST APIs? So anyone can go for it. Laurencio, Jeffy, Farkin, either one of you can take a crack at it.
So the HTTP API is, there is just one-time connection between client and server. Client asks a question to server simply and gets the response, and the connection is done. But for WebSocket API, so the connection is open and in real time, the server and client by connection is open can discuss and ask questions to each other.
I just want to say that REST API basically, it's just a subset of the HTTP APIs. So basically, any request that has a HTTP protocol is an HTTP API. REST makes no difference. It has just some architectural design to keep the standards, make your life easier. And Open API specifically refers, as you said, as you showed at the beginning, to REST APIs, documenting REST APIs, so putting together the coding, the standards of an Open API with a REST API makes life easier among developers to have some standards and not go far away from that.
I think simply put, HTTP is really, sorry, yeah, Jeffy, go for it.
Yeah, REST in short is representational state transfer, and it is meant to transfer the state of a resource. That's what, and that really makes our life easier as learners. Yeah.
Absolutely, and really to think about it, HTTP is the underlying protocol. So I think HTTP is not limited by REST. I think if you've worked with GraphQL I think also works with HTTP APIs. That is the underlying protocol for GraphQL as well. And I believe gRPC API as well, I think falls under the same category, although gRPC typically operates at HTTP 2.0 level if you're going with that. Whereas I think with REST and GraphQL, you can still work with HTTP 1.1 and higher. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of what this is. WebSockets, again, the way what it's trying to accomplish with WebSockets is really more like streaming of information. Essentially, it's a stream of information that is being sent from one end to the other in almost an uninterrupted way as much as possible. Whereas with something like REST APIs, you go with more the request response route, where you've got a request coming in, you send back a response. Whereas with WebSockets, you essentially have an open connection through which data can move freely across them. So that's typically the main difference between them. I've seen a couple of hands raised. I'm going to go to Sachin first because Sachin has asked a question as well. So I think, Sachin, I've got your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself, go ahead. Feel free to ask the question live if you would like to do that. Sachin?
Yeah, thanks for the chance. So my question is that, right, when we start, we do not have any environments as such to host our API specification, right? So from the beginning, do we need to maintain it as a document, or does it has to be hosted on some environment so that this would not be touched once we start developing our code? That's what my question is.
Do you use any Git solution on your project? Do you, Sachin, you use Git? Store it there. Like you can store it there. That's it. So moreover, if you use something like, I don't know, GitHub, Bitbucket, whatever clients for Git, it's nice to develop it together with other engineers, open pull requests, having code reviews over your Open API specification. Simple as that. Treat as code.
So would you say that?
Go on. Sorry, in that case, we end up not using Swagger editing tools, right?
Well, I think you can integrate with that. I think there are plenty integration tools to integrate with Swagger tools. I think they also have Swagger Hub where you can store your Swagger documents. So there are plenty of solutions. I just gave you one, like store it in Git, but you can choose whatever fits for your team.
I think
thank you.
Certainly having a version control system of some sort, or at least making sure that you're not changing something that's live in production without thinking about backwards compatibility is really, really important. And a lot of tools will help with that. And it's something that you need as things inevitably evolve.
Yeah, and I think that's the ultimate thing, where really, I think your question is absolutely spot on there, where what happens if you are changing the spec that is already in use, perhaps across one or multiple environments, and you obviously don't want to get in a situation where things are not predictable. The last thing, the biggest key in software development is keep things predictable as much as possible, if not at all times. So I think you need to have things that are predictable. You don't want clients to be surprised at any point of time. You need to have communication from a human side, but equally have the right documentation and versioning if possible, which will help people to A, not have breaking changes, and B, to be able to explore things that you might be working on as well. And it reduces your own headache as well, where you don't start suddenly getting requests where, oh, why is this not working today? It was working yesterday. You don't definitely want to get into that situation. So by all means, I think like Laurentia mentioned, version controlling definitely out there. Check out the Swagger toolkit. I think there are a lot of different ways in which you can manage this, especially if you can integrate directly with GitHub as well. But the Swagger ecosystem really provides you ways in which you can make sure that you're not overwriting any of your existing documents, especially if there are environments associated with them. So there are definitely ways in which you can do that. I would recommend checking out Git as well as checking out Swagger. Cool. Thank you so much for that question, Sachin. I know Aaron Aaron, you've got your hand up, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask us your question.
Hi, thanks. Yeah. So firstly, in theory, so on paper, totally on board with standardization, thorough documentation, trying to maintain that. Totally resonate with a lot of those arguments made for design before code earlier. My questions, I have two questions that are more about the in practice, I guess, that I'm keen to canvass opinions or experiences on, about trying, essentially there's part of it is a buy-in and part of it is a technical challenge. There's of the two. So I'm on the developer side, can probably guess, primarily back-end focused. We're building out a, let's call it a shared service internally that is going to cross multiple product lines. So that means that we have the first problem is the question of product ownership is very in flux, which means it can be difficult to maintain a single source of truth when there are lots of people trying to claim ownership of what's going on. You know, we're gonna have a lot of endpoints, a lot of services being rendered from one central resource. So having something that everybody agrees on in practice can be quite a challenge. So that's the first point. The second point, on a more technical note, in terms of design versus just at a certain point just getting started, so that there is some kind of at least MVP that we can use as a proof of concept or start steering the conversation. Classic developer mindset there, of course, is that given the nature of this project, the requirements change extremely rapidly. There's always another update, another request, or we just need to change that specification, or this schema needs to change, or this handshake needs to change. And so if where we started trying to document this out quite thoroughly and have thorough cataloging and diagramming and documenting of all of this, it sort of went out the window at some point when we were essentially spending all of our time updating the documentation to reflect the changing needs and no time at all actually trying to build the thing. So yeah, two areas there that I'd love to hear some practical experiences or suggestions on.
Shall we start with you?
Actually,
yep, sorry.
I have an example for that. So for schema change. So normally, so in code, let's say that there is an endpoint and you are making a request to that endpoint, and you want that there is a request validation with the schema. So that schema should live in your code, and then you should document it somewhere so that your consumer understand what parameters your endpoint needs. So in this situation, you need to update two sites, like the code site schema and then the documentation schema. You need to change both. But the feature that we implement with Tyke at the moment is that you write the documentation, but it is used in the code at the same time. So changing one place will fix all the problems. So there are no multiple usages of the same schema and copy it on different parts. So just single source of truth, and when you change that schema, it's changed everywhere in terms of user documentation or in terms of coding side. So that's just one. I know that is a problem, but so I just mentioned the solution of that problem with that.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? As soon as you start having to synchronize multiple documents or multiple sources that are trying to do this or define the same thing, you're going to get into all kinds of problems. I think the continually moving goalposts is an interesting problem, and to some extent it comes down to, I feel like I've said this already. It's a process thing, isn't it? It's getting to consensus, defining a version, publish the version, and then additional versions are going to come as the world changes. I mean, one other thing, I know this is slightly off topic. Another direction, of course, is you go down the path of one monster source of information with the ability for your consumers to query that information and pull out what they want. And so something like we'd call it a universal data graph, but a GraphQL front end to a large predefined API where the client can decide exactly what they want and what form it comes in is another alternative. But at that point you're moving into a different area, and you need additional skills in your client side team.
But at the same time, would you? Sorry, go ahead, Laurentia, before I jump in. Go on.
I'd like to say on the second topic that Aaron raised, that while you're developing POCs and MVPs, you don't have time. You want to release something out there, and So I perfectly agree with that. It happens to all of us. As I said, we're developers as well. But my thoughts are that once the POC is out or the MVP is successful, starts producing value for your company, you should start thinking seriously about adopting API documentation, doing API documentation, as it will keep growing and growing. And if you don't take time and build it deeply into your process, later on you'll have problems with other teams integrated with your solution, developers adopting. The teams will start growing as well. So learning curve for developers will be pretty big. And yeah, reasons like that. So I would make sure to include in the process of development if the process.
Absolutely. I would resonate with that absolutely with the adding to the process bit, because ultimately I think what you got to think about is there is going to be a lot of long-term pain, because the biggest challenge that comes with trying to continuously build towards changing goalpost is that you are probably not keeping track of exactly the path you have taken to get here anymore. You don't have that degree of documentation anymore, but at some point you will have to go back there, because ultimately you'll still have to build on that same code base, and that has to be consumed. And the consumption of an API is always going to be dependent on good documentation. And if you're talking about developer experience specifically, then easy onboarding of any developer with your application is going to be very, very important. So at some point, you'll have to take that. And if things are built into your process right from the beginning, that becomes like a bit by bit add-on, as opposed to, again, trying to tackle a behemoth at the end of something that you feel that you have completed, you feel that you are very proud of, but ultimately it is not complete, because the definition of done, definition of completion is always going to include proper, good, well-documented application and products. And if it's not there, it's not done. So it might give you that false sense of safety and security that, oh, we've built something very, very quickly because that's what was required. But ultimately, those same people who have changed those requirements will come back and say, hey, we don't know what's really going on here, because you now have to get other people and developers involved, and then you'll have to sit and go through every single thing that you have done and decipher everything that has come before. So I think it is a difficult thing to do. It is a very difficult thing to adopt, but I think if you can add that to your process as early in that life cycle as possible, the better it is. You could take Laurentzio's approach as well, where you start off with a POC where you don't really bother that much. The objective of POC is to test out the technical ability, the technical possibility of what you're trying to build. By all means, if that is the case, then it's done. But beyond, once you start moving towards a production ready environment, then I think you need to seriously think about how you're going to be approaching things a little bit long term. So absolutely.
One more thing, it's in my opinion, it's just a mindset problem, and the comparison I did at the beginning with test-driven development applies here as well. Like at the beginning, you don't start doing TDD because you don't see the immediate advantages. You think like, okay, I'm an engineer, I'm gonna jump on writing code. You don't see value as an engineer on writing documentation or tests. So usually you measure productivity by writing code. So, but that's not the case. People that start until they see the benefits of that, and the same happens with writing your documentation of APIs. So.
And I think if you're looking for an example from the industry where we are talking large scale organization with potentially changing goals very, very quickly and trying to adapt to things and dealing with high transaction volumes and stuff, eBay is a really good example there, because eBay is actually built or using Open API Specification. So again, I need to go into the history of how they got started. Or maybe they did not start off straight off with OAS, but they definitely saw the value of it at scale. And I think today they're using it. So at their scale and the volumes that they are operating with, and potentially changes and updates that they are making across multiple teams. So there's definite value there, and I would encourage you to potentially look at the eBay story a little bit as well. I think if you're looking at examples out in the wild. We are really short of time, unfortunately. Hopefully this gave everyone a good understanding of what design-driven API management with OAS might look like. There are certain pros, certain cons that we spoke about. There is one question, Anja, I think maybe we'll make that the final question. Anja, if you're with us, if you want to unmute yourself, perhaps go ahead and ask your question, and we'll make that the last one for today. Anja, are you with us? Otherwise, there you go. Okay.
Hello.
Hey.
Yes, hello. I'm Anja. I'm an API developer and API designer. And my question, actually, I worked on a project. We generate Swagger for APIs. And on the other side, so architect write Open API the documentation of the API. And we wonder if we must share the Swagger generated by the code with the client, or the Swagger which is written by the API designer. Certainly, we can find gaps between two Swaggers, but what is the best practice? What, according to your experience, what do you do in your projects? So which Swagger you share with the client or with the consumer?
Great. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I'll start, and I'm happy to be. People can fill in the gaps. I think for me, the key thing is is avoiding having two definitions of the same thing. And I think that's the challenge. Is how do you get a high quality spec that has all the information that a user would want to have into your source code? But I think that's probably step one, would be try and get away from having two documents that are describing the same thing, because like Furkan says, you end up with a real challenge keeping them in sync. And it's just, and personally put it next to the code. And if your engineers are able to write rich documentation that can just be extracted directly, fantastic. If it's something that's added or sort of augmented after the fact, once the code's been written and some additional information is added, I think that's perfectly viable. But keep it all next to the code, if at all possible, would be what I'd have thought. But what does everyone else think?
Yeah, having one single source of truth, I think it's essential. The one you should be sharing with your clients, I think, is the one that's more accurate, that it's actually working, and not one that you think is working. But so stay closer to the source of truth. If it's your code base, then stay with that, because in the end, you don't want to ship something that it presents a feature or that is not implemented and is not working as expected. But yeah, I agree on the side that it should be just a single source of truth. And it should be a close collaboration between architects and developers. It shouldn't be architects dictating what's happening, or no, it should be a very close collaboration. Every role has their specialization, that's true, but everyone should be able to contribute and put their minds into developing the document.
Yeah, and I would say if you get to the point where you have that single source of truth, your QA, whoever's doing the QA, can use that as the test spec, I suppose, that they're testing against. So you've got a really nice linkage between exactly how the code works and exactly how you prove the code works, because you've got that single thing that defines it, hopefully.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been a great discussion. I think there is an anonymous attendee who has shared a really useful link. So I'm going to share that in the chat as well, which is Good Mocky Designer Tool. So by all means, people in the audience, go ahead and check it out. It seems really, really interesting. It's about mocking of APIs, I believe, which is very, very useful. So with that, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic discussion. We are about 3 minutes off. And there's some really, really good questions that have come through. I think we can go on with this discussion a little bit more. We've discussed a few pros, potential cons, potential challenges and adoption of open standards such as Open API specification in organization. So hopefully this was a valuable discussion, as exciting as it was for all of us involved. Hopefully you would agree, Laurencio, John, Furkan, Jeffy. This was a really, really great discussion, and we would love to come back and have a follow-up discussion on this. Or if you have any further questions, do feel free to reach out to us, or either on LinkedIn or over email that we'll be sending you right after this. So thank you so much. It has been wonderful. We'll be back again later this month, I think, with our 50th edition of the API Hangout, where we'll be talking about developer experience specifically and how you might just be doing it wrong. So what is the right way? We'll explore that. We'll find out. So definitely stay tuned for that. Till then, it's been lovely speaking with all of you. Thank you so much for joining me for this session, John, Furkan, Laurencio, Jeffy, and thank you everyone for the lovely questions. They are really, really interesting ones to think about, and hopefully you got some value out of this as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.